All right, good afternoon, everyone. Just give folks a second to join here, and we will get started in just one moment. All right, good afternoon, and welcome to docket number 240805, the Annual Energy Storage Solutions Program Review for Year 4. My name is Chairman Marissa Gillette, and it's a very special day. It's our first day with Commissioner David Arconti joining us. I'm also joined by Commissioner Michael Karen. So we are here this afternoon for a technical meeting, the first technical meeting of this year's annual review. We have an agenda in front of us today that we'll be turning to in just a moment. A few housekeeping reminders, please, especially if this is your first time joining a pure remote technical meeting. As a reminder, we do have a court reporter with us, so please make sure that you are identifiable by name and affiliation, especially the first time that you speak, so we have a clear record. Because of that, we also ask that you refrain from using the chat function. That is not part of the official record. So if you have a comment or a question, I do need you to verbalize it to become part of the official record. Thank you for your cooperation with that. During today's technical meeting, we will turn first to questions from PURA staff. After that, time permitting, we will open it up to other stakeholders. If you are a stakeholder that has a question on a presentation today, I ask that you familiarize yourself with the raise hand function under the reactions tab at the bottom of the screen. And we will turn to questions from stakeholders, time permitting. Before we adjourn today, we do have plenty of time set aside for any discussion or public comment. We are just kicking off this docket, so there is a lot of roadway in front of us for additional comments, written or otherwise, throughout the remainder of this proceeding. So with that, I think that takes care of opening remarks. And our first presentation is going to come from our program administrators. I do thank everyone for filing that presentation in advance, very helpful. We have, looks like a presentation team assembled from the Connecticut Green Bank and Eversource, and we have personnel available for questions from UI and our EM&V consultants. So without further ado, let me turn it over to our presentation team. We do have the slides if it's easier or better for you all to control them. On your side, it should be enabled for you to share screen. So if you just let us know your preference, and then we can get you started here. And Mr. Krill. Oh, Ms. Runyon, please.
Yes, hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Runyon, and I am with Eversource, and I'm pleased to be here with my colleagues from Eversource, Green Bank, Guidehouse, and United Illuminating. We had thought that you guys would be sharing the slides. We can do that, but if you want to pull them up, that would be, I guess, preferred. Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, we have a lot of information to present to you today, so let's get right into it. So our next slide, got a little agenda. So we'll start with a short introduction about the program. We'll move into a summary of the main findings from the 3-year evaluation report for 2022 to 2024. And a slight change, we are going to have our colleagues from Guidehouse present that, but they were listed as speakers, so hopefully that should be no problem. Next, we'll look at the ESS program application and deployment levels by month through June of 2024, including an analysis of the low-income and distressed municipality participation. Then we'll go over some proposed changes to the passive dispatch window, and we'll look at next a recommendation for a percentage of ESS incentives to be distributed equally among tenants at a multifamily housing sites. And then we'll close with our proposed upfront incentive rates for both the residential and the commercial sectors. All right, next slide. And one more. Thank you. So the ESS program was created under Docket 171203, RE03, the following objectives. We want to produce net benefits to all ratepayers. We want to provide electrical grid benefits, including resilience, peak shaving, and ancillary services. We want to foster the sustained, orderly development of a state-based electric energy storage industry. We want to provide resilience to benefits to customers and environmental justice communities, or who are experiencing economic hardships. We would like to reduce the barriers to entry for storage deployment in Connecticut, maximize the long-term environmental benefits with respect to emissions reductions, and maximize benefits to ratepayers derived from the wholesale capacity market. All right, and with that, I'd like to turn the mic over to Guidehouse to present a summary of the main findings from the 3-year evaluation report.
Yeah, hi everybody, good afternoon. This is Tyler Only from Guidehouse, which is the EM&V consultant that was introduced earlier. And so I'll be going through a lot of the tables and information that was published in the June report, which was for the 2022 through 24 sort of evaluation of the past 3 years. In some cases, that information was updated in an August report that was more recently filed. And so again, I'd point back to those 2 reports for a lot more detail than what I'll be covering here, but I'll go through a lot of the highlights. So first, I'll talk through these summary findings from the program tracking metrics, and this is looking at overall enrollment. So that top table that we show here, you can see how many megawatts of energy storage have been submitted, approved, or complete. So they are now installed and active. You'll see for residential, in both cases, these are split out across residential and the C&I sectors. And in some cases, the residential and C&I sectors are further split out into maybe sub-customer types. So in this first table, again, we see residential and C&I split out. We see residential, there's been about nearly 4 megawatts that have of systems that have been started to enroll in the program. Many of those are still in the submitted or approved stages, not yet complete and active. On the case of C&I, there is quite a bit more megawatts that have been submitted into the program and approved. And approved, as it is discussed, as it is discussed in the report. Approved is sort of approved for receiving upfront incentives, approved to participate in the program in the future, but have not yet actually been installed, inspected, and complete. And so as we're looking at the 50 megawatt program goal for the 2022 through 24 season or cycle of 50 megawatts for both residential and C&I, we see that neither residential or C&I sectors have gotten particularly close in terms of total completed megawatts. In the case of C&I, though, we've exceeded that target in terms of total systems that have submitted or applied. Moving on to the next section, talking about low income and underserved. Within that 50 megawatt target for the residential sector of enrollment, 40% of that was identified, intended to be underserved or low income residential customers. And so we have it split out here in terms of megawatts that have enrolled within, for a certain customer segment, and also number of participants. And there's one project in particular that's highlighted in the reports where there is a multifamily affordable housing system that has quite a few participants that classify as low income. And so we see here actually that a good number of the participants in the program are low income. And so that brings the total number of participants in residential participants in the program very close to 40%. And that's in terms of total approved and completed projects to date. But in terms of megawatts, it's still a little bit less than that 40% target. And then the last thing I'll highlight on this slide is the average days to approve and complete project application. In the very early days of the program in 2022, you're seeing relatively high number of days to completion, high number of days to approve an application. Now in 2023 and 2024, we're seeing much shorter wait times for approval of applications and completion. One thing I will note, though, is on the CNI sector, we still have yet to see systems submitted after 2022 become complete as of June of 2024. And just sort of goes to show there's still quite a bit of time needed for a CNI application to go through the full submission, approval, and completion project. And there's some more notes on that in the report. A big piece of that is just installing and actually getting the CNI system up and running, which does take some time because these are very large systems in some cases. So I'll maybe go to the next slide. And there's a lot of info here, but this is looking at sort of averages for each of the customer types and utilities in terms of the system sizes, as well as the incentive and upfront cost for those systems. So for residential systems, we're seeing systems on the average of 7 kilowatts by 18 kilowatt hours. Generally, these systems are paired with PV. The CNI systems we're seeing much larger, maybe on average 2 megawatts by 5 megawatt hours. Those are less often paired with PV, whereas residential, it's almost 100%. For CNI, it's much less than that. We're seeing upfront incentives that are covering on the order of 20% of the upfront cost to customers. And those upfront costs seem to be aligning pretty well with expectations as far as installs. We will see that residential low income for United Illuminating is a little bit lower in some cases because of that multifamily affordable housing project. But overall, we're seeing these costs sort of start to average out across the different utilities and across maybe some of the different customer types. Now we can go to the next slide and start to talk about some of the evaluation metrics. So these are maybe slightly different from some of those program tracking metrics in terms of total numbers of enrollments. Now we're looking at how did these batteries that were completed, installed, connected to the DERM system, how are they actually performing in events? So there's a lot of different cutouts in this table of different slices of how these batteries may have been performing. I'll note in these events, we're really primarily focused on the residential systems. There was only one CNI system that was participating at certain points in time, relatively smaller CNI system as well compared to some of the metrics that we were looking at in the prior tables. And so this is largely looking again at the residential performance and looking at from a lot of different angles. I'll highlight specifically that second row of this table that looks at how the program did during the actual 2023 ISO New England peak hour. In total, the program reduced the peak demand in ISO New England by 186 kilowatts, which is really good for the amount of enrollment and total installed capacity. The average power per participant of 2.9 kilowatts was the highest, I guess you could say, of all the different event windows that we look at here on this table. But I will note that 2.9 kilowatts and in each of these other rows, we're seeing numbers on the order of 2 kilowatts. That's relatively lower, perhaps, than you may expect from what I was just referencing as the average system size for residential systems, something like 7 kilowatts by 18 kilowatt hours. If you were to take that 18 kilowatt hours divided over 3-hour event and reserve some amount of backup capacity that a lot of the battery manufacturers maintain, you might expect something more like 4 to 5 kilowatts of peak dispatch during a 3-hour event. And so getting more like 2 to 3 kilowatts shows maybe there is some performance things going on. And so we can talk to that a little bit. But maybe we can go to the next slide and before we talk through that. So there's a little bit more info here on other findings from the evaluation. I'll maybe start again at the top here about battery performance. So there's information here about how often the batteries were available. That is, was there available telemetry data? And it's almost 100% availability for the data. How much solar energy was used in terms of actually charging up the battery? Are we seeing batteries charging up, coincident with co-located solar PV? And in this case, we're seeing that, quite often. There were some cases where PV was not used to charge the battery. For some batteries, they were charging up at night or after an event. And some batteries, this is more the exception than the rule, but there were some batteries that were not paired with PV as well. In general, we saw negative bill savings for these customers, not a significant amount per customer. It's much less than the incentive that they're receiving, the performance incentive and the upfront incentive that they're receiving for participating in this program. But it is negative, which is something we would expect because a lot of these customers are on standard flat electric rates, so not the time of use rates. And batteries have some efficiency loss where they end up charging more than they can discharge. For the emissions, we actually end up seeing positive emissions savings. And so, as I was just alluding to, there is some net energy loss from those efficiency losses, but that is overcome by the relative difference in emissions that we're assuming for on-peak versus off-peak charging and discharging. Then maybe I'll turn to the bottom left corner, the bottom left table, looking at when events were called and how coincident they were with peak. So as we had noted before, in 2023, the utilities did call an active dispatch event that coincided with the annual peak for the year. So that's 100% alignment. There's some less alignment in some other views of peak dispatch. In some cases, perhaps the event was called, an hour early or an hour later than the actual daily peak for ISO New England. And in some cases, there are seasonal peak periods that may differ from those peak hours. But in general, they hit the peak more often than not. And then the last table on this slide is looking at the outages. So we did see a couple instances, maybe just as one step back. The utilities were able to pull information for participants who experienced outages during our analysis period. And we did see several instances of participants who experienced an outage event. And we looked at the telemetry data for the batteries to see how those batteries were dispatching during those outage events. We didn't see any major outages in the data that we saw. And so how we define that is, are there more than 10 participants who are experiencing an outage at the exact same time? We saw a lot of more isolated outages where individual customers were maybe having an outage, sort of randomly. There were a couple instances of, very short duration outages of less than 5 minutes. And we didn't have a lot of information to say or to really identify if the batteries were outputting during that time because the battery telemetry data is in 15-minute intervals. So it appears that those batteries did not dispatch during those events. When in practice, they likely did provide some level of backup, but not enough to show up in the 15-minute interval data. For events that were lasting longer than 5 minutes, we did see those batteries dispatching, which was indicating that they are providing that backup power that would be the hope. And so if we go to the next slide, I can talk through a little bit of the BCA numbers here. So for the BCA, we ended up using the actual enrolled information and the actual performance in 22 and summer of 23 in our BCA. A lot of those numbers are overshadowed, I'd say, in terms of how it impacts the total BCA compared to future-looking estimates. So we see in table 5-3 that's in the report and copied here, we have assumptions about total megawatts of enrolled energy storage that far exceed the total amount that's currently enrolled and complete in the program. And so we have assumptions that in some cases, a lot of the CNI enrollment that is forecasted here is already approved. For the residential system, a lot of this megawatts of enrollment will need to be applying and submitting shortly to get approved in time. But we have these assumptions about total enrollment to get up to sort of the total target, which I believe is 300 megawatts by 2027. Those targets are also then split down into individual customers based on these ESS specifications listed down in table 5-6, which is shown here. And so those largely mirror the system sizes that we've seen to date that have been enrolled and installed. For the CNI systems, it's perhaps a little bit smaller actually per enrollee, but it doesn't have a huge impact on the overall BCA in terms of how many customers are enrolled. The primary driver is really the total megawatts. And so if we go to the next slide, I'll talk through some of the results of the BCA. And a really important thing here, we have a slide on counterfactual number 1 and counterfactual number 2. That's referring to the AESC, which is the Avoided Energy Supply Components study for New England that was just released in 2024, an updated version of this study. And this study provides all of the system-wide avoided costs that are used to monetize benefits for the benefit cost analysis. The key benefits would be things like the avoided generation capacity costs and DRIPE associated with capacity. Those costs differ based on the counterfactual that was assumed by Synapse, who completed the AESC study. And what we mean by counterfactual, the way that the AESC study is conducted, they end up looking at, let's model out the entire ISO New England system, utility system, gas and electric, for sort of a future state with and without some amount of demand side management measures. And so counterfactual 1 looks at some blend of energy efficiency, electrification, demand response, and behind the meter energy storage. And that blend then becomes effectively the unit basis for the avoided costs they look at. So for counterfactual 1, it is that blend of EE, electrification, DR, and behind the meter energy storage. When we say, the avoided cost of capacity under counterfactual 1 is $50 per megawatt, it's $50 per megawatt of blended DSM. And under that counterfactual, we see relatively lower avoided costs for capacity. And so looking across the total benefits here, we end up seeing the combined RIM of 1.18 combined across residential and commercial. And 1.18 is greater than 1, indicating there is net positive benefits to ratepayers. But as a lot of people on this call know, there's a 1.4 target for the RIM for the whole program. And so actually the program would not meet that 1.4 target using counterfactual number 1. One other thing to point out here is the PCT, that's the participant cost test, trying to look at what the benefit is to a participant in the program for participating, really comparing the incentives, that red box, total upfront and performance incentives, to the installed cost of the battery. And what we're seeing is that for residential systems, that's lower than 1. And so actually the installed cost is higher than the total net present value of incentives, as well as this avoided backup generator, which is our measure of what the benefit of reliability is. But for the CNI sector, that actually is greater than 1.0, that PCT, indicating that they have, largely due to the economies of scale for the battery, they have relatively lower installed cost compared to the incentive value. So this is for counterfactual 1. If we go to the next slide, we'll see counterfactual number 6. And counterfactual number 6 is looking at exclusively the avoided costs for behind the meter energy storage. So this was a new counterfactual that was introduced in this latest 2024 version of the AESC. It did not exist in 2021 or 2018, when this program this energy storage solutions program was being developed. And those were the previous iterations of the AESC. And so in this latest AESC, they're looking specifically at the benefits for energy storage. And so in this case, there is a much higher value of avoided capacity. I think that's leading to much higher BCAs, especially for the RIM and the societal cost test. And as we go across here, the Connecticut efficiency test as well, which is pretty similar to the program administrator cost test, which is the third in this table. In this case, the combined BCA for the RIM is over 3.0. And so that would say the RIM does exceed the 1.4 target. You'll notice the PCTs have not changed in this table, and that's because the PCTs are not affected by the AESC total utility system benefits. For the customer, it's really a matter of what are the incentives compared to what are the installed costs. And so I'll just emphasize again, there's a big difference here between counterfactual 1 and counterfactual number 6. The counterfactual number 6 and I'd say our opinion as Guidehouse is appropriate to apply because this is a behind the meter energy storage program. Counterfactual 6 is designed to look at the benefits associated with behind the meter energy storage. It accounts for things like a proliferation of electrification leading to winter peak demands, and actually winter peak exceeding summer peak in the mid to late 2030s. And so a lot of those impacts where energy storage, or a lot of those, the impacts of a changing energy system where energy storage could be beneficial, we end up seeing those benefits come through in this BCA. So I think that makes sense there as an appropriate counterfactual to use. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide and shifting gears a little bit to another section of the reports that we've included. Another piece of analysis that was done was this research questions that were asked in surveys of participants and non-participants. And so there were a few different questions here that we're summarizing. So one is, what were the barriers that were preventing potential residential customers from participating? A lot of those customers identified costs as a major barrier, and also just program awareness in general. So a lot of customers were not aware of energy storage solutions. There's another question about barriers specific to low-income customers, and one of the items was that there is some technology awareness issues. So some of the low-income and underserved respondents were less aware of the opportunity to install energy storage. Another question, could incentives be used to overcome these barriers, and how would customers respond to different incentive levels? We ended up seeing sort of this scale where a relatively low number of customers would choose to install storage for a net after incentive cost of maybe $15,000, and only moderate increases to install at a total install cost of $11,000. So indicating that even more incentives would likely be necessary in terms of upfront or maybe total lifetime incentive to make a battery worth it for a customer. And that's sort of echoed then in this last thing, or this last item. What level of incentives are standard and low-income customers willing to participate at? And so for a standard customer, an upfront cost of $36,000 was about right on average. And for a low-income customer, that number was about $2,000. And so if we go to the next slide, sort of my final slide talking through key findings and recommendations. So one key finding, the program continues to track below its installed capacity target, especially for the residential sector. On the C&I side, there's certainly enough total megawatts approved to date, although maybe not all installed yet. And so a recommendation from that may be for the residential sector, especially building on some of those findings from the survey. It may make sense to increase incentives, especially for those low-income participants. Another finding, the energy storage systems connected to DERMS did not perform optimally in events. I had noted this a little bit on a slide prior, but we might have expected higher performance in some of those events. So what the recommendation coming out of this is that program administrators should continue conversations with battery manufacturers around the capability of their batteries to perform in uniform dispatch and to better understand backup reserve settings or other settings that may be hindering performance. Another finding, average passive event participation varied greatly across the summer season. And so again, there are some slides on this later in the presentation that I know of, but program administrators should continue to investigate sort of the passive event participation and confirm with battery manufacturers how battery storage systems could best comply with any passive dispatch requirement. And then the last finding listed here, so the overall program residential BCA results vary significantly when modeled using either the AESC counterfactual 1 or number 6. So I just touched on this a little bit. Counterfactual 6 provides much higher BCAs. We end up seeing RIM values that are much greater than the 1.4 target. I think in our perspective, from the Guidehouse perspective, it likely makes sense to consider the impact of using counterfactual number 6 for the AESC, because I think it makes sense to use it. It captures the full benefits of energy storage. But taking a close look at which benefits are really important for Connecticut and what that RIM target, or if there is a Connecticut efficiency test target that should be put in place, are all things that may be worth considering. And so for the program administrators in particular, this may lead to some ability to look at higher incentive levels as well if the existing RIM target stays in place, especially given the lower relative PCT values. But I'd say maybe more generally for the folks on this call, it may make sense to take a higher level look at the overall BCA targets given the AESC counterfactual number 6. And so I think that was the last slide for me. So I may turn it back to Jen.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Now we're going to look at program application and deployment levels. And that, I believe, is Green Bank team.
That would be me. Thank you, Jen. My name is Ed Kranich, Senior Manager of Incentives with the Connecticut Green Bank. So thank you, Jen, and thank you again, Tyler, for your presentation. So here we have an overview of the residential and CNI project approvals in the last 12 months. As the top of the table here shows, the residential application volume was still quite low by our expectations. We saw application rates come nearly to a halt late last year in anticipation of the final decision, which was expected by most stakeholders to result in an increase in the incentive level. So that's why things kind of slowed down last year in expectation of the incentive rates going up for Resi in January. The rates picked right back up early in 2024, and they remained steady into this summer for a total of 138 applications and nearly 1.5 megawatts of new residential capacity to be approved. So in the next table here, we have CNI, which tells sort of an interesting story. The volume was essentially non-existent since the last annual review, even though we had the announcement in December 2023 indicating that we would be pausing the CNI applications by June 15th, later extended to a little bit later in June. So the developers on the CNI side tend to work in ebbs and flows and kind of batch their projects. And that was evident this year when we set the May deadline for the large CNI projects to make it through our board of directors approval process. So we received even more applications following that for our June board of directors meeting. So in total, we did 42 new applications approved between May and June. And adding in the 2 from last August, does our 3-year target of 100 megawatts in really just a few months. So just over 100 megawatts in total, 241,000 or 241 megawatt hours worth of energy capacity. And just a quick note here also on the residential side, we do have one active only project that's approved and one other active only project that's on hold because it's a Tesla project and we're just waiting for their in-app enrollment and everything to be completed. So you can add two to the list there, but those ones weren't technically approved as an upfront incentive. Yeah. So next slide, please. As mentioned in the last slide, the residential deployment is still working uphill for a variety of reasons, including installed costs and really just competing expenses with homeowners. So storage is still not really as compelling a sale as solar is, but we are hopeful, particularly with some recent activity in the program and notably some large providers getting more active in ESS. So between August 2023 and June of 2024, we saw 21 residential projects that were identified as underserved for about 205 kilowatts of capacity. These ones are simple to identify because they don't need any special signature or approval by the customer, affidavit or anything, because they're strictly just based on the town where the customer resides. So we can verify that very easily. However, on the other side, on the other priority customer adder for Resi, we haven't received any applications since August 2023 that were identified by the contractor as being low income. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there were no low income customers, since that does require the contractor to ask and the customer to identify. But speaking strictly for accessing the upfront incentive adder, we've had no projects that have come in qualifying in the single family world. Again, we remain hopeful, and we really look forward to multifamily affordable housing being the key to accessing that market. Next slide, please. There it is. Might be on a delay here. So onto contractor and TPO enrollments, third-party owners. So this is a big reason that we're hopeful that our outreach is really working. In a couple sections from now, we'll be talking about some of our outreach as well. But we've had quite a bit of interest from new and existing businesses that wanted to add storage to their list of services. This spring in particular was a record number of new contractor applications. We had 14 in total from March through May. So a big pull for new C&I contractors was that the C&I application pause was coming in June. And a lot of people said, I really want to get in on this before it ends or before it pauses in June. So we had 3 new contractors who actually accounted for 30 of those 42 C&I projects between May and June of this year. So we had a couple of really big ones come in who had a lot of work already lined up. So the highlight here is that we've had 24 new contractors join ESS in the past year, most of which came in the last few months. Of those 24, 15 are both residential and commercial, and 9 of them are commercial strictly. So we've had an average submission to approval time for applicants between from August of last year to June of this year. Average time is about 30 days from the time that they first submit their application to the time that we send them their credentials to log into the Salesforce platform. And that includes a lot of back and forth sometimes if they don't submit something correctly or if there's a document missing. So there's a lot of that lead time where some of that is in our court, some of it's in the contractor's court. And we have, you'll see in the annual review and the recommendations that are coming or that were submitted last week. Once those if those are approved, we have a couple of recommendations to streamline the contractor approval process too, to hopefully speed things up a little. But overall, accounting and kind of plucking out some of the outliers, we had a median time from submission to approval for new contractors of 13 days, which we're pretty proud of. And a total number of contractors in the program as of June was 72. So next slide, please. So onto the new technology. If you recall from last year's review, we revamped the new technology approval process to help the program admins better understand the eligibility and streamline the approvals. So just understanding each applicant's, exactly how they operate, how they integrate with different inverters or batteries and DERMS. So we've got that process a lot more nailed down based on our experience. And as a reminder, we only allow residential new technologies to join ESS if they're UL 9540 listed, which is inverter and battery combined, which can be a little bit tricky sometimes because we have just an inverter company apply, just a battery apply. But what we look for is the whole package that has the UL 9540 listing. And they also need to be fully integrated and up and running with the DERMS provider. So Energy Hub in the case of residential, and on CNI, that's with Generac Grid Services. So this is to help prevent any projects from being approved for incentives if they're so-called pre-approved, which is what we used to do in past years. So we'll have certainty that the system can communicate with the DERMS and can fully participate once it's up and running. So we've had a steady stream of new technology apps come in this year. Most notably, the kind of biggest players that have resulted in the most volume from their products being eligible are Franklin, Whole Home, and Fortress Power. And notably, we've also had an application come in from Tesla, who is now eligible, just pending their in-app enrollment process being set up with Energy Hub, and a company called Pylon Tech, who had several new batteries that they're hoping to break into the Connecticut market with. Next slide, please. So on to payments. So from August 2023 through July 24, the Green Bank issued upfront incentive payments for 182 residential projects totaling $957,848, and for 2 CNI projects totaling $187,800. So as Tyler mentioned in his slides, we have 150 or so megawatts approved of CNI projects, but only a total of 3 now are complete. We're waiting on 1 or 2 more that we were alerted by the contractor had finished in July, so we'll be getting those payments out. We also, just notably on this chart here, there is one project, a CNI project, a little bit smaller. I think the rebate was $176,000. That one was, the completion was submitted before July, but the payment technically went out last Friday. So next year we'll be reporting on that one. Also noteworthy is that, we only run 1 batch of payments per month, both for Resi and CNI. And we keep the schedule posted on the contractor resources page on the esct.com website. So the schedule has all the dates they need for each month, for each year, including when the materials need to be submitted for completion and when you can expect payment if you meet these deadlines. Next slide, please. So onto inspections. As I'm sure you recall, the Green Bank's third-party inspections were made optional in late 2023 for the beginning of 2024. So since last year, so going back August 23 to June, there were a few months in there where we were still requiring inspections. So we had 52 inspections total since August of last year. But since making them optional, the opt-in has dropped pretty significantly. So through June, only 14 inspections were conducted. So that's about a 13% opt-in rate for the last year, or for the year 2024. Next slide, please. So we're going to transition over to marketing now. And I will start by saying that our marketing director, Rudy. He was planning to be here for this part of the presentation, so I am going to jump in and do these slides for him unless he gets here in time. Hoping that he'll be around for questions. But so just beware, I am presenting these, but I didn't unfortunately compile all the information, so I will do my best.
Mr. Kranish, if it
Yes.
helps, I was thinking about maybe breaking up the presentation a little bit with some questions on slides that have already come, so we could
Sure.
maybe get some questions in from Pura staff on the first 22 or 21 slides that we've had. And Mr. Arpin, I know, has a number of questions. So maybe we can start with that and then resume with the marketing slides.
Sure.
I'd like
That works for me. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank the Connecticut Green Bank and the program administrators for providing these slides today. I would first like to turn to slide 6. So if Mr. Bumpin could please turn to that slide. So my first question, have application approval and completion timelines decreased further since the conclusion of the application process working group? And if not, please explain why. And this can be directed to any program administrator or to guidance.
Hi, Mr. Arpin, I'll field this one. So I'm sorry, and just to clarify, your question was, have the average days from submitted to approved, or was it approved to completion dropped since the application working group?
I'll submit it to approve.
Okay. So the timeline from submitted to approved has decreased since 2022. The application working group, the items that we've deployed that were identified in that report from March 15th, we haven't completed all of them yet. So the application working group, we were expecting to do the work in about 2 phases. The first phase was what we could, the items from the application that we could eliminate immediately, which were a couple of fields that really weren't specified in the program manual. And a lot of the rest of them are actually in the draft program manual that we submitted last week. So we had to really wait until we could formally codify that in the program rules. Additionally, we are still working with the utilities on setting up data sharing between the interconnection and RES teams, so that we can share data and we can have information on projects before they come in, projects that are identified as having storage. So in short, yes, we have made changes from the APWG that have decreased the average time from submitted to approved, and we actually have more on our plates for I believe Q4 is what we had specified for what we're looking forward to setting up for the rest of the changes.
Thank you for that response, Mr. Kranich. Now, Mr. Bumpin, could you please turn to slide 9? So my question here, could the program administrators please explain why event participation decreased as more devices enrolled in the program? I'm not sure if you want to take that, Mr. Kranich, or someone else from your team.
I can take that. This is Sam Songaila from Guidehouse. So yes, as you noted, event participation decreased as more devices enrolled in the program. We believe this could be attributed to a couple different reasons, one of which is noted here on the slide. Some different battery manufacturer settings. As more devices enrolled, there were more OEMs that enrolled as well. And so that could be contributing to these decreased levels of participation. And I would like to note that this is also an area of further investigation as the program continues and more data is collected.
Okay, thank you for that. So just to clarify that the primary reason would be the addition of new OEMs that are unable to participate in passive dispatch events.
That could be a potential reason. I can't say that with any certainty with just one summer of additional data under our belt at this point.
Okay, thank you. And are there any other reasons that Guidehouse or the program administrators have looked at?
There are, and this is Jennifer Runyon with Eversource. We will be getting into passive dispatch and active dispatch performance in later slides, so we will get more into depth there.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Now continuing on this slide, could the program administrators please explain why residential system PV charging was below the 100% level expected from participating residential systems? If I recall, I believe in last year's annual review, the program administrators had submitted something that suggested that 100% of systems that are residential would be charging from solar PV. So I was wondering why that changed in this filing.
I think the Guidehouse team might be able to help us with that one. Sam,
Yeah.
you could. Or Jen, sorry.
I mean, I would add that what we did discover is that oftentimes, not often, but sometimes the batteries just didn't have enough time to fully charge from PV. So if you imagine the dispatch event takes place until 8 p.m. at night, the next morning, it's overcast, cloudy, the batteries just don't have enough time to fully charge from solar in order to participate in the next window.
Thank you for that response. Would any of the
Mr.
other...
Arpin, this is Sergio Carrillo with the Green Bank. And if I may add, these are part of the conversations we're having with the OEMs right now. We believe there's some setting in the batteries that is allowing this to happen, right? We noticed right after events, some batteries show that they started to charge either, well, obviously from the grid. It was 8 p.m. So we are trying to understand why this is happening, and we should take corrective actions in the future.
I appreciate that response, Mr. Carrillo. So staying on this slide, Guidehouse had discussed how the estimated bill savings are negative and how most residential customers are not currently enrolled in time of use rates. Would bill savings be positive if residential customers were enrolled in time of use rates?
I can jump in on that one. Thanks, Mr. Harpin. So Eversource actually recommends customers look into time of use rates. I believe I think it's 80% of your consumption is in the off-peak hours. So I can't speak for Guidehouse, but I don't believe we looked into the potential because we don't know the exact hourly usage profiles of each residential customer. In short, yes, you could save money through that time of use arbitrage with a battery, but it would depend on the specific customer and their usage patterns.
I appreciate that response. Now I'd like to move to slide 10, please. So my question here, could the program administrators please explain the RIM impacts of updating prospective assumptions about customer enrollment?
I could, yeah, this is Tyler Olney from Guidehouse. I can probably answer that question, but could you expand a little bit on that question?
Yes, I believe the original program enrollment forecast in prior years had residential systems enrolling earlier in the program than originally anticipated. So my question was, how will this new enrollment forecast affect the RIM? Basically pushing enrollment trends looks like further into the future here.
Yeah, and so to the extent that avoided costs are higher for later years, which is the case for some of these years in particular, moving some of the same megawatts of enrollment to the later years would increase the RIM. And so that's reflected, any of those impacts are reflected in the updated RIM values that are shown on the following two slides. Yeah.
And to follow up on that, could you expand a little on why the avoided cost would be higher in later years?
It would depend on the individual like avoided cost stream. In some cases, like I could speculate on some of the avoided cost streams that would be important for this program, like the avoided generation capacity cost. That value, I think, does go up in some of the later years because of assumptions around the supply demand balance that is in the AESC forecast. But again, I think a lot of that would be maybe speculation as far as like why the numbers are higher. But I could just tell you from like reviewing the AESC that they are higher in some cases.
Okay, thank you for that response. So my next question, staying on this slide, given that residential enrollment currently remains low, could the program administrators or guidehouse please comment on the likelihood of residential enrollment reaching 28.3 megawatts by the end of this year, which I believe is what table 5-3 forecast?
I'll comment that those are the annual enrollment figures. So that would be an additional 28.3 megawatts enrolled compared to what was already enrolled as of the end of 2023.
I appreciate that clarification. So just to follow up then, could the program administrators comment on the likelihood of reaching this target? So I believe if you include currently enrolled systems, it might be over 30.
So I think the likelihood of reaching of enrolling another 20 plus megawatts within this year is very low. Given even if we were to transfer the existing connected solutions residential customers over, I think the total in there is only about 10 megawatts or so. I don't know if maybe Jen could confirm that or not. So I think finding an additional 10 to 20 megawatts of residential customers on top of those transfers, yeah, it's pretty unlikely. I think we're just approaching 5 megawatts now in total.
Yep, I would agree.
Thank you for that response. Now I would like to move to slide 12, please. So my question here, does BCA modeling under counterfactual 6 assume that significant peak reduction will also take place during the winter through the ESS program? Because I believe that Guidehouse had mentioned the possibility of winter peak reduction under this counterfactual.
Yes. So it does, this BCA for counterfactual 6 does include winter peak reduction benefits.
Okay, and that's modeled under the current active dispatch structure for ESS,
Yes.
or some form of passive.
Yes, the current active dispatch program.
Okay, thank you. Now I'd like to turn to slide 14, please. Could the program administrators please explain the steps that they have taken so far to increase multifamily housing program enrollment, if such enrollment is key to residential participation in the program? And that question is directed at the program administrators.
Mr. Arpin, this is Sergio Carrillo with the Green Bank again. You may have heard that we, the ESS PAs, joined the multifamily affordable housing working group. We're trying to work with the group to see how we can increase deployment in multifamily affordable housing. One of the things that we highlighted in our written comments was related to wiring diagrams, right? It had been brought to our attention that there seems to be an incompatibility between solar and storage for multifamily affordable housing and the participation in ESS. And it relates to the fact that the solar that serves a multifamily affordable housing has to be front of the meter. To connect the battery to that solar, the battery will have to be then front of the meter, which would make the battery ineligible to participate or to take incentives through ESS. So those are some of the early conversations we're having with the multifamily affordable housing working group to try to identify, okay, what are the barriers and what can we do? I think another part of our written comments was related to Solar for All funds that will be coming to Connecticut. If we can use some of those funds to increase incentives specifically directed to affordable multifamily housing, that could impact deployment. Again, these are some of the conversations we're having at the time.
I appreciate that response, Mr. Carrillo. Do the EDCs have anything that they would like to add to that discussion, in particular relating to wiring diagrams not being suitable for solar plus storage to enroll behind the meter in ESS?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Mr. Arpin. I would like to add that we have filed with PURA wiring diagrams to allow behind the meter storage in multifamily affordable housing units. I believe that they are, I'm not sure exactly, they were filed in the RS docket, actually. So those exist.
Thank you for that response. So moving on to my next question here, could the program administrators please comment on the outcomes of their conversations with battery manufacturers regarding passive dispatch capabilities and participation levels?
I would love to take that question. Yes, and we do have a bunch of slides prepared. I'm not sure if we'll get to them because of our timing, but essentially there is a setting that looks out for storms. And what happens is the batteries are instructed to hold their charge when the National Weather Service issues any weather alert. And so what happened is, let me get my talking points here so I explain this correctly. So you might think, well, of course, that makes perfect sense. We want those batteries to be fully charged if our customers might lose power, of course. But what we found was that the National Weather Service issues all kinds of advisories, including high heat advisories or excessive heat warnings. And those warnings were triggering those batteries to hold their charge, even though those heat warnings do not really coincide with grid outages. What they do coincide with, though, is summertime in New England. And so it was that setting that was stopping the batteries from participating the way we would have liked.
Thank you for that response. So have the program administrators discussed with OEMs the possibility to change those settings, to exempt excessive heat advisories?
We have ongoing discussions with them. One OEM has agreed to turn that setting off for their customers in the Eversource territory. But again, it's ongoing, and we're still trying to decide, how that setting should really be set to guarantee performance.
Thank you. Now I'd like to turn to slide 19, please. So my question here, have the 23 new technology applications approved in the last year connected with the program's DERMS provider yet? If not, could the program administrators please explain why?
Yes, they have, Mr. Harpin. So they may not all be from 23 different OEMs, I should say. So sometimes one OEM that's already been approved, they're already integrated, they can submit an application and it's like, you know, a one-day approval, just showing that they have the UL 9540. So we don't have any new technologies get put on the list. Unless we know that they are integrated with the DERMS.
Thank you for that response, Mr. Kranich. And now my last question for this section of slides, Mr. Bumpin, could you please turn to slide 21? So of the projects that were inspected, does the Green Bank have an idea of roughly how many failed inspection?
That is a good question. Unfortunately, I don't have that data in front of me right now. I can try to pull it either after the presentation or hopefully by the end. So I can get back to you with that.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you. And those are all of my questions. I would like to thank the program administrators for their presentation so far, and I'd like to turn it back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And let me just check, Mr. Kavanaugh, did you have questions on the slide deck that we've seen so far?
Just one on slide 14. Thank you, Chair. Perfect, thanks. Okay, thanks everyone for joining. So on the right column, recommendation column, the second recommendation, my question is how frequently do audits of battery interval data currently occur?
I can take that question, Mr. Kavanaugh. So the audit occurred it was this spring, and what we're actually recommending is to do more of these audits. So we have actually since set up recurring monthly meetings with the OEMs through this summer to review the past month's data to make sure that batteries are performing as they should be. So not often enough in the past year, and that's what we learned from that audit. So more frequently in the future during the active seasons. Yep.
Thank you. That's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we were back at slide 22, and Mr. Kranich, if we haven't, if we have not killed enough time, then it's back to you for the marketing slides.
I appreciate it. Thank you. So we're at slide 22 here. Okay, so changing gears back to the marketing efforts here. So in the first half of 2024, from January 1st to July 15th, Green Bank's marketing campaign was active, and it was focusing on zip codes with the highest differential in monthly average emissions versus the rest of the service area. And note that there is a typo here on the screen that said that this was 2 segments. We're only talking about this one segment here. So working on 4 key metrics, the campaign was largely a success based on the 4 metrics of contact form submissions from EnergyStorageCT.com, performance against industry benchmarks for these types of ads, web traffic and engagement, and awareness studies survey results, which were conducted in earlier in the year and then again a little bit later in the year. So next slide, please, and I'll get into these 4 metrics. I think that I think you might have skipped one. Could you go back one slide? Oh, I'm sorry. My notes here are a little bit out of order. So go, sorry, go ahead one slide, please. I'm sorry, back one. We might be on a delay here. It'll say landing page form submissions. There you go. Okay, thank you. So the first metric here is the landing page form submissions, or our contact us page and box on the energystorageCT.com website. So we had an uptick from the previous year at 290 form submissions. These emails get packaged and they go right to our shared energy storage at ctgreenbank.com inbox, where any one of our staff can access that inbox. We all share it and we respond through that method. So, like I said, there's an uptick from previous years. Of these, notably 15% were from the targeted areas. And in all of 2023, these same towns accounted for only 12% of submissions. So overall, that was a success in that we've increased by 3 percentage points. We can tell that the additional marketing in these target areas has resulted in a 3 percentage point increase in traffic to our contact page. Next slide, please. Or not in the traffic to the contact page, but in the actual submission of the contact form. So next, performance against industry advertising benchmarks. So we had 3 million total impressions in Connecticut for this campaign. Above average benchmarks and click-through rates on the Google search ads and digital display ads, as well as the NBC View completion rates. So that's when you're streaming video and you can choose to or choose not to click skip ad. So that's actually pretty good that people had continued watching all the way through on the advertisement. So there's some engagement there. And some other forms of advertisement, like native ads on websites and LinkedIn, were a little bit below average. Next slide, please. So onto web traffic and engagement. This one's interesting. So year over year, web traffic and engagement improved with nearly a 10% increase in number of sessions on the ESC or EnergyStorageCT.com website, ESCT.com. So this resulted in a near 30% increase in total page views, which is measured by what's called an event count. It's a measure of site engagement, which was up by nearly 1/3. So we're seeing not only more traffic to ESCT, but the quality of these visits is increasing, which generally shows that customers are more interested and they're clicking through more pages and they're spending more time on the website. And next slide, please. So onto the awareness study results. Our awareness study highlighted that awareness of both energy storage technology, batteries, and the program are growing, which is great. So, and that's especially evident in the targeted zip codes. So in those targeted zip codes or target zip codes, we found that familiarity with energy storage systems increased quite a bit, actually from 50% to 62.5%. And these customers were much more aware of the program compared to the general Connecticut population. So that does show that the awareness and the impressions and kind of understanding of the program was successful in these targeted areas. So that's 52.5% of those folks versus 36.8% for the general Connecticut population. So within these targeted zip codes, familiarity with the technology, awareness, and most importantly, the likelihood to look for more info after viewing an advertisement for the program increased substantially in really just 6 months from January to June. So it's encouraging results to show that the interest is there. Despite the residential, kind of pull through rates all the way through to new projects being relatively low, there is a genuine interest, especially when we put the effort in for the marketing. And I will also say that Rudy has joined the room. So if there are questions, I will certainly defer to him on these. And I hope I did his slides justice. So next slide, please. And I believe it's going back to Jen.
Okay, let me just see. I know we just interrupted with questions, but does the Pura team have any questions on the marketing slides?
I do not. Thank you.
Okay, great. Then, Ms. Runyon, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right, so we are going to talk about our proposed changes to the passive dispatch window. Now, before we get into this presentation, I would like to share one thing, and that is that Connecticut's Energy Storage Solutions is a cutting edge program. There are very few, if any, other utilities offering programs that combine both active and passive dispatch of battery. And I can say that with confidence because for the past 17 years before I started at Eversource, I was a journalist covering the energy transition, first looking at renewable energy generation, and then focusing specifically on electric utilities in North America and abroad. For the past 5 years, I was putting together the educational content for Distributech, which is the largest annual conference for the distribution utility industry. And I joined Eversource last fall because I was so energized, and that pun is intended, by what is happening in this space. And I really wanted to help make it successful. And so the reason I say all of that is because when we are pushing the envelope, when we are trying new technologies and figuring out how best to use energy storage on the grid, we're going to have learnings along the way. It's not going to work perfectly the first time. And in my opinion, that's perfectly okay. All right, so let's get into it. So next slide, please. And one more again. So of note, our EM&B Consulting Guidehouse prepared many of the tables you're going to see. So I'll be pointing out the high-level key takeaways. But if there are specific questions about the numbers, after we've concluded, I'll look to Guidehouse to help answer those. All right, so batteries in the program are supposed to passively dispatch 80% of their capacity and leave a 20% reserve on all non-holiday weekdays in June, July, and August. So slide 29, where you're looking now, this is a summary of the events. This is showing how many days passive events took place. There were 42 and 47 passive event days for Eversource and UI, respectively, during the 2023 summer season, which really was the first true test of our passive dispatch batteries. The numbers are different because active dispatch events override passive, and different utilities have slightly different strategies for when they're going to call active dispatch events. All right, so next slide. So here we're looking at residential device passive performance by partner. Now we've anonymized our battery partners. We do have 3 different OEMs that are participating in this program. The most important columns to look at here are 4 and 5. And I'd like to talk about the difference between nameplate and available capacity. So as we sort of touched on earlier, nameplate assumes a fully charged battery that would, in theory, dispatch down to 20% reserve capacity. But sometimes that battery doesn't have enough time to charge fully before that passive dispatch window opens again. So again, as I said earlier, imagine a scenario, the battery is dispatched in the evening, the next morning it's pouring rain or overcast. There's just not enough solar to fully charge that battery. So we decided we'd also look at available dispatch. So this would be a battery that would take whatever charge it had left and dispatch down to that same 20% reserve. So again, directing you to those columns 4 and 5, the main takeaway here is that if we are basing the program on nameplate capacity, performance really wasn't very good. Only one OEM was able to give us what we were seeking, about 36% of passive dispatch hours. The other 2 really didn't perform at all. If we base the rule on available battery capacity, performance improves a little bit. We jump from 2% compliance to 13% for OEM 1, 36 to 40 for OEM 2, and 5 to 37% for OEM 3. And that's just looking at Eversource performance, but you can see UI performance is also similar. All right, the next slide again. Thank you. So this slide is showing active and passive and how far it was from the target deployment amount. Passive dispatch is shown in green, and the black color represents the distance from the target deployment. For active, we're looking at the yellow is what we wanted, and the blue part of the bar shows, again, the distance from that target performance. So again, key takeaway, batteries didn't perform the way we wanted them to. Now, why? We've already kind of discussed why. So it's that storm setting that we believe had a major impact on our battery performance. So let's flip to the next slide. And one more again. Okay, so now that you've seen how the batteries performed, should come as no surprise that when we're talking about compliance with the program, it's also not great. So to be fully compliant in the program, batteries need to participate in 90% of passive dispatch hours, or they face a clawback of 10% of their program, of their upfront incentive each year that they're not compliant. So looking at the first line of this table, you can see that 0 batteries were compliant with the program rules, and that doesn't matter for looking at nameplate or available capacity. If we dropped that 90% to 60% and looked only at available capacity, we'd have 10 compliant systems. And if we dropped it to 30%, we'd have 21, and so on. Let's flip to the next slide. Thank you. So slide 34, this is another way of looking at compliance. You want to look at that light blue color on figure 3 on the right. And that's where some batteries were compliant under a 30%, 40%, or 50% rule. All right, let's move on. What are we recommending we do about this? So next slide, please. So we certainly don't want to take money back from 100% of customers in this program at this time, especially because we know that storm setting played a key role in all of this underperformance. And in many cases, that was out of the customer's hands. So our first recommendation is to shorten the hours from 5 hours to 3 hours. And when we look at the peaks over the past 2 summers, we see that they almost always occurred between 5 and 8 p.m. We'd recommend a shorter 3-hour window. The next slide. This is another way of looking at battery performance. You can see that it does decline over that 5-hour window, which again gives us some confidence that a 3-hour window will result in better performance. And the next slide again. Then we looked at the rim. So what would a 3-hour versus a 5-hour window, how would that impact our ratepayers? And we found that the rim actually improves with a 3-hour window if customers fail to receive an active dispatch signal, or if the EDCs didn't call an active event and the peak occurs. So the next slide, please. This is summing up our key findings. A 3-hour window more closely coincides with the peak, possibly improves uniformity of dispatch, and we find this has minimal impacts to the BCA. All right, and our last slide on this deck, please turn to that. Here are our recommendations. We'd like to shorten the window. We'd like to make it 3 hours, and we'd recommend that it be 5 to 8 p.m. We're also recommending prorating the passive dispatch clawback penalty so that it is no longer a yes, no, compliance, non-compliance. Instead, we propose to take the amount of underperformance and penalize the responsible party with the fee that would be reflective of the missing dispatch KWs, those kilowatt hours that were not dispatched when we wanted them to be. And then last, I do want to emphasize, as we said earlier, we are working with the OEMs to better understand StormGuard and these different storm settings and passive dispatch settings so that we can ensure batteries will perform in upcoming seasons. All right, that's the end of that.
Thank you. Runyon,
Yes.
can I interrupt? And I think our staff have a number of questions on your passive dispatch recommendation. So I think this might be another good time for questions if you're amenable, and I can welcome Mr. Arpin back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Bumpin, could you please turn to slide 29? So my first question for this part of the presentation, can the EDCs please explain the difference in the number of passive event days across both EDCs' respective service territories? I assume it relates to active dispatch strategies between the EDCs, but I wanted to confirm.
Yeah, that's correct, Mr. Arpin. As you're aware, active events override passive dispatch events, and EDCs take slightly different strategies when they're calling active events.
Could you elaborate a little on the differences in those strategies between EDCs?
think I'd have to take that back to our operations people, unless there's somebody here on the call that would like to jump in.
If not, that's okay. We can move on. Thank you, Ms. Runyon. Now I'd like to turn to slide 31. Could the program administrators please explain why passive dispatch performance may have declined as the passive dispatch season progressed?
That's a good question. I don't know if Guidehouse has theories on that.
I was actually just going to state here, Mr. Arpin, that I think in Tyler's presentation, he had mentioned that as the season had gone on and a larger variety of OEMs had joined throughout the season, that presented more opportunities for that OEM to not have their systems properly what's the word, configured to participate in passive. And I see Tyler just jumped on. Is that accurate, Tyler?
Yeah, and yeah, I think that's right. I think I'd also say there are a lot of reasons generally, but I think there are some instances here where you see there could have been instances of this like storm guard functionality, especially in that August timeframe where you see, for particular OEMs, it just looks like almost none of the batteries performed. It's a very large black bar. And I'd also point to towards the end of August there for OEM 2 and OEM 3, you maybe start to see a little bit of an apparent decline in, over successive days. And I think that could be, what Mr. Runyon was talking through, where it's batteries may not be fully recharging in time for some of these events if there is some bad weather. So I think that question probably has a very wide range of possible contributing factors.
Thank you for that response. Now I'd like to turn to slide 33. So given that all systems remain non-compliant with the program's passive dispatch requirement, how long do the program administrators expect the clawback provision will need to continue to be waived for program participants?
I can answer that question, Mr. Arpin. So in the annual review and the program and the proposed program modifications, we recommended that the passive clawback be not only adjusted, I think as Jennifer might have mentioned, to only claw back a portion of the incentive that was unearned, essentially. So not an all or nothing approach, as is currently written in the manual. But to waive the passive dispatch clawback for the seasons 2022, 23, and 24. So we wouldn't begin considering the clawback until the 2025 season next year.
Thank you for that response, Mr. Cranch. So to follow up, the program administrators haven't decided yet whether the clawback provision would need to be waived again next year in 2025.
We did not propose that, no.
Okay, thank you. Now I'd like to turn to slide 36.
Oops, excuse me. I just like to jump in. Amy Finley from Eversource. So appreciate that question, Chris, because it's something that we have been thinking about, where really the value of offering that upfront incentive is attached to the passive dispatch. So I think we need to be very considerate about how long we delay the clawback. So that is something that is on the top of our minds as well. Just making sure that the full value of offering that upfront incentive is being realized, because otherwise this sort of, perhaps requires us to go back to the drawing board with the full sort of BCA analysis as well.
I appreciate that response. Thank you. So now moving on, if the passive dispatch window were shortened to 3 hours, and if a daily peak occurred outside of the 5 p.m. through 8 p.m. proposed time window, would the EDCs expect the call an active dispatch event to cover such a peak?
Absolutely. Yep.
Thank you. And the EDCs would receive enough time from ISO New England to call such a peak, just to confirm.
Yeah. Mhm.
Now moving on to slide 37. Could the program administrators please explain why the passive dispatch performance load shapes varied by OEM?
Yeah, again, this is about different OEMs sort of figuring out how best to deploy their batteries in a passive dispatch setting. Each one took a different approach, and we got the results, and we are working through how to make it better.
Could you explain why the different OEMs might have taken a different approach to the passive dispatch?
I think we might have to ask the OEMs that. I don't have the answer to that, but I can certainly get back to you on that.
Okay, thank you.
I can speak a
Now-
little bit just from experience with our thermostat programs. You know, you have a long dispatch window. It's not necessarily a thermostat's going to provide the same load shed, or a battery is going to provide consistent load shed over that entire window. So that's sort of what Jen was getting at, is that there's different sort of dispatch strategies or optimization strategies that the OEMs have that we're looking to more fully understand. And this is sort of true, across the board with all of our connected device programs, because we don't have, industry standards for, if we call a 3-hour event, what one OEM's battery is going to do versus another. Same thing with thermostats.
I appreciate that response. Thank you. Now I'd like to turn to slide 38. Could the program administrators please elaborate a little more on why the RIM would increase if customers failed to respond to all active dispatch events and reverted back to the passive dispatch baseline, particularly if an electric system peak occurred outside the passive dispatch window during an active dispatch event?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think what we're trying to show is that the 3-hour recommended event or time frame is mostly going to cover the peak hours, and the passive dispatch exists so that if we miss a peak, it's there to support. I think that Tyler from the Guidehouse is actually better suited to further elaborate on the RIM, so I'd see if he's available.
Yeah,
Would you elaborate on that, please?
yeah, and I'd highlight that there's a little bullet in the bottom left that says note the RIM increase is beyond current levels. It's really because the assumed customers would not receive the performance incentives under the assumptions in this table. So the idea is these customers are still giving you, in theory, a 3-hour dispatch event that's coincident with the peak, but they don't get a performance incentive because, in some way they've not participated in the active event. They've failed to respond to those active events. It's a pretty contrived scenario, I would say. But what this is really trying to show is the active dispatch events, assuming you're calling them when there are peaks, that's really driving the majority of the benefit of the peak reduction. The passive dispatch is there to catch some of these edge cases or these scenarios where the customer isn't participating in the active event. And so, yes, under that case, if you're getting some peak dispatch without having to pay the performance incentive, the RIM looks better and the PCT value would then look worse for those customers. And so it is a little bit contrived again, but more of a thought experiment to show how things might vary.
That makes sense. Thank you for that response, Mr. Olney. Now I'd like to turn to slide 39, please. So my question here, how confident are the program administrators and Guidehouse that the proposed adjustments to the passive dispatch window will have minimum BCA impacts?
I'll take this one again, Tyler from Guidehouse. I'd say it's high certainty, I'd say, in terms of that it wouldn't have much of an impact. I think from the perspective that if we're looking at this as a collective program, the program generates benefits from peak reduction. And whether that peak reduction is coming from the active dispatch program in name or the passive dispatch program in name, I think what we've identified here is that most of that peak reduction is going to occur in peaks that occur in this 3-hour time window. And so whether it's coming from like a quote unquote active event or a quote unquote passive event, or whatever the settings are that are enabling that peak reduction, it's really trying to get coincident peak savings at that time to maximize benefits for the program. If that's coming from called active events or called passive events, it wouldn't impact the BCA, which type of event it's coming from. Changing the passive dispatch window, I think there would still be other reasons to do that. As we've been talking through, calling a 3-hour event may be easier from the perspective of the OEMs. I'm not an expert in that piece. And then we know that the coincidence is probably still going to be very high with that 3-hour event window. But yeah, assuming that you're still getting peak reduction coincident with the hourly peak here, there wouldn't be any change to the BCA.
Thank you for that response. So would there be a scenario where it would negatively impact the BCA if the passive dispatch window were shortened? And if so, could Guidehouse elaborate on that a little more?
I could not think of I couldn't think of I think what it would have to be is if you shortened the passive dispatch window significantly to the point where it's consistently missing the peak event and the active events were not being called or customers weren't participating in the active events. And so then you were consistently missing the peak. In that case, then you wouldn't want to shorten the passive dispatch window, but you would need to have like a really inconsistent peak period, and it would have to be really hard to forecast, and that's just not the case right now.
I appreciate that response. Thank you. Now my final question for this portion of the presentation, Mr. Bumpin, could you please turn to slide 40? My question here, how do the program administrators propose recalculating the participation percentage that activates the upfront incentive clawback?
Yeah, I would say we are, sorry, Sergio, you want me to take a stab at that?
I was going to say something, yes, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Mr. Arpin, yeah, we're currently talking to OEMs to understand. I think Tesla made a very concise proposal in the written comments. We need to understand, again, we need to continue these meetings with the OEMs to understand what their batteries can and cannot do, to be able to propose a recalculation or a calculation of the percent participation that can be applied equally to all OEMs. Designing a calculation per OEM would be complicated, inefficient. It would be too much of a headache. So we're currently engaged in those conversations, and we will propose something short.
I would just add that we do receive our active event performance at the end of the season, and we make multiple calculations looking at each and every battery's performance. So I do think it is possible to look at underperformance just the way we look at active performance. It will involve much more calculating, but I think it can be done.
Thank you for that response, and I thank everyone for this portion of the presentation, and those are all my questions, so I turn it back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And Mr. Kavanaugh, did you have a question?
Just a couple. Thank you, Chair. If we could refer to slide 30, please. Perfect, thanks. So bullet number 2, do the program administrators know what the numbers would be if you exclude from the calculation devices that did not participate?
Are you asking if devices that did not participate at all whatsoever in either passive or active dispatch?
Just the footnote with the 2 asterisks, just the equation the calculation that you used, it says it's inclusive of devices that did not participate. And so I'm just asking if you pull those devices out of the calculation.
That's a good question. Mr. Olney, I don't know if you have a answer there. I don't think we did look at that though.
Yeah, and I'd turn to Sam as well on our team, on the Guidehouse team. I don't know if Sam, you're available for that.
Hi, this is Sam Swingala from Guidehouse. We have not to date looked at excluding devices that did not participate. I can say, though, that most devices participated at least a little bit. So there wasn't, I wouldn't say that there's a large cohort of devices that participate not at all that are dragging these numbers down significantly, but I don't have exact metrics on that at this point.
That's helpful. I appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, if we could just go to slide 39. Perfect, thanks. So right column, recommendation number 2, do the program administrators expect that shortening the passive dispatch window would result in changes to the timing or frequency of calling active dispatch events?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We have discussed that internally, and the answer is no. We would still call active dispatch exactly as we do.
Appreciate it. Thank you. That's all. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And Attorney Wheel, do you have a question on this set of slides?
Yes, thank you, if that's okay. Hi, Tom Wheel from the Office of Consumer Counsel. I just had a question. I'm not sure, it sounds like maybe this hasn't been worked out yet, but about the mechanics of how the prorated clawback would work. It's my understanding, I remember like we had similar discussions back in 210805 about adjusting the clawback. I think that's where the standard got changed to 90%. Performance kind of became the compliant standard, and then I think the clawback there, if it did apply, it was like 10% of the total upfront over like annually for each year out of compliance to stand for the like 1/10 of the overall program timeline. I guess I was just a little confused by the statements here about like the prorating, like clawing back the like a proportionate amount. Would that mean like there'd be some, would it be like the percentage of the total performance for the given year that's missing would be the percentage of the upfront incentive that's clawed back? Is that the idea?
That's exactly the idea. Yeah, because what we've realized is, these, if they're not complying, but say they're complying at an 89% rule, why would we take away all 10% of their upfront incentive? Why wouldn't we just penalize that 1% of underperformance?
Okay. And one other question, that same decision, I was reminded when I looked this up, another kind of program change that was allowed was for exceptions for good cause. I had forgotten that, but I was curious if that applies like to the current situation where the clawback's being waived altogether because of like technical issues outside of the program participants' control. Is there a reason why that standard couldn't just be applied on a case-by-case basis, which I thought was the idea of the good cause waiver?
So, Mr. Wheel, I can say in the manual, or at least as it's presented for the new version, we did add in quite a bit of extra language in giving the PAs the ability to determine the cause of the issue. And essentially it says each underperformance and clawback situation would be determined on a case-by-case basis, where we would identify what the issue was, and then most importantly, whose fault it is, and then apply that new clawback calculation, and then assess it as a fee to whomever is responsible. So if the customer intentionally changed something in their settings, then they would be responsible. But if there were just a setting by the OEM that didn't work out, then they would be assessed as responsible.
Okay, so it sounds like it's similar in concept maybe to that same idea of like a determination, a waiver for good cause. It's just sort of maybe making clearer like how good cause is determined. Is that the right idea? Meaning like if it's not a customer's fault, then there's good cause to not impose the clawback on that customer, it sounds like.
Right. Yep.
Okay.
That's right.
Thanks. Those were all my questions. Thank you, Chairman.
Attorney Will, if I may add, I think it's important to highlight that we are in the early conversations of this topic. We need to work with Guidehouse, develop BCFs, understand whether there are impacts to the PCTs and et cetera. So this is not very, it hasn't been vetted entirely. So just FYI.
Thanks.
Thank you for that. So I think we can pick back up on slide 42, maybe.
Excellent. All right. So, yeah, now we're going to look at the percentage of ESS performance incentives that we could share equally among tenants of a multifamily affordable housing unit. So slide 42 here, what you're looking at, this is what we were asked to do, to recommend a percentage of ESS incentives or project net benefits that could be equally distributed among tenants of a multifamily affordable housing site. So we looked at potential PCTs for different, in different scenarios, with or without incentive sharing. We did a quantitative financial analysis and we excluded RRES benefits. And we looked at systems that are standalone storage systems, so they were not enrolled in RS at all. Okay, so before we go to the next slide, I'll tell you our first learning was that there are many, many, many different flavors of multifamily affordable housing units. So you could have a small, a medium, or a large building with many units that are all on 1 meter, with the utilities included in the rent. That would be known as a master metered scenario. You could have a small, a medium, or a large building where everyone has their own meter, but the landlord still pays utilities. So that would be some sort of sub-metering arrangement. Then you could have a small, medium, or a large building where everyone has their own meter and all tenants pay their own utilities. You could also have a very small, like a 5-unit house with all of the above potential configurations. And I'm also aware, I happen to volunteer at a transitional shelter where we have a 5-unit building. 2 units are on 1 meter, 3 units are on another. So again, there's just many different types of configurations. But we wanted to give it a shot doing some analysis. So next slide, please. So here we looked at 4 different building types. And I'd like to direct your attention to the blue bar at the bottom. And those are the PCT scores, and they drop below 1.0 when we start to share 20% of the financial performance incentives, with the exception of a large multifamily affordable housing building, which is taking residential incentive rates. So let's move to the next slide. So then we looked at that smaller 5-unit multifamily affordable housing. We're thinking of a small storage installation here. Perhaps it powers common areas during an outage, like the stairways or the parking lot. And again, we found that the PCT does drop well below 1.0 because it's already below 1.0 before we're sharing any incentives. So the next slide. So for now, what we'd like to recommend is that for a multifamily affordable housing unit, the project owner keeps all of the financial benefits of the performance incentives, although the tenants will of course, benefit from the resiliency. But we're not totally comfortable with that idea, and we really wanted to study it more. So we've asked, and we were approved to join the RRES Multifamily Affordable Housing Working Group, so we can continue to explore how to share these benefits equally among tenants and project owners. All right, that's it for that part of the presentation. And I can turn the mic over to Sarah Pine with the Green Bank to review our proposed upfront incentive rates.
Sorry, I totally missed my cue.
That's
Mr.
okay.
Mr. Arpin, any questions on this set?
Yes, just a couple of questions. Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Bumpin, could you please turn to slide 44? So my question here, do the program administrators have an idea of what proportion of multifamily housing projects would be small versus large units?
To clarify, you're asking, so how many buildings in Eversource or UI territory would fall under these different types of scenarios? Is that the question?
Yes. So a small multifamily housing project versus a large multifamily housing project.
Yeah, at this time, I don't have that data. I don't know if anybody on the call does, but we could certainly get back to you with that information.
Okay, thank you. So now staying on this slide, considering that multifamily affordable housing projects receive residential incentives, could the program administrators please explain whether the PCT score for multifamily housing projects is higher than a conventional commercial project with lower upfront incentives?
Mr. Arpin, would you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Yes. So the question here is whether the PCT score would be higher for a commercial project, a conventional commercial project, versus a multifamily affordable housing project, considering that multifamily affordable housing projects receive higher residential upfront incentives.
Yeah, I will let Guidehouse weigh in, but I would say with it, when we have a CNI rate, they have a demand charge. Energy storage works very nicely to reduce those demand charges, which does result in a higher PCT.
And yeah, I'd agree with that. But I'd say the big driver of the differences maybe between these, like why we're seeing lower PCTs here is because we're seeing a higher installed cost in terms of like a dollar per kilowatt hour basis, and or even a dollar per kilowatt basis. And the upfront incentives are paid out on that dollar per kilowatt hour basis. The performance incentive is kind of paid out on the dollar per kilowatt hour basis as well, if you assume it's, always a 3-hour event. And the battery is, has a duration of less than 3 hours. And so anyway, that unitized cost is really like the tipping point for the PCT. There certainly is more potential benefits from a CNI rate in terms of the bill savings, but that wouldn't, as far as bringing it from like 0.66 to 1.0, that largely comes back to the installed cost of the battery.
Could the program administrators elaborate on that a little more on why the installed cost would be higher for multifamily affordable housing projects versus conventional commercial projects?
And I certainly wouldn't say that's the case, that that multifamily affordable housing has higher cost for energy storage than a typical CNI project. All I was saying is for this particular slide that we're showing right now, where we have that $32,000 installed cost for a 9 by 18 kilowatt to kilowatt hour battery, those are largely based on what we've seen for individual residential storage systems. And so that's where for this like small project slide, where we may assume, I don't know the exact configuration of the housing, but maybe every unit has a personal battery. That something like that would be more expensive to implement and install on like a per project basis than a large multifamily affordable housing unit with a single, megawatt by multi-megawatt hour system, which is, where on the other side, we saw maybe a PCT more like 1.0 for a system like that, where it's a more economies of scale and it's cheaper to install.
Thank you for that response. Those are all my questions in this topic, so I turn it back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And we can keep going, it looks like.
All right, we're going to review the proposed upfront incentive rates.
Thanks, Jen. This is Sarah Pine from Connecticut Green Bank. I promise this is one of the last two sections we are going to go through today. So the program administrators would like to start by highlighting the current residential enrollment stats that we've observed since July of 2024. Both Ed and Guidehouse have covered a lot of residential stats today throughout this presentation that would relate to this proposal. Firstly, residential enrollment has shown some progress with total capacity reaching 3.6 megawatts in the first tranche. This marks a considerable uptick, reflecting in the effectiveness of the incentive increases as seen on this slide that were implemented in November 2023 following the final decision in Docket 230805. That being said, this is a little bit lower than PAs have anticipated. From January 2024 through June 2024, January 20. Program administrators approved about 104 new residential applications, which represents about a 55% increase from the same period in 2023. The changes made in the final decision, coupled along with marketing efforts that Ed and Ruby covered earlier in the presentation, are beginning to yield some positive results in terms of engagement and participation. Further, we've also seen some increase in projects in underserved communities in the first half of 2024, which is about 20% of new applications that came in from these communities. And it's a notable rise from just 5% in 2023. Next slide, please. Thank you. In this slide, we will be discussing the current battery cost data, which is a significant barrier to deployment and how it informs our proposed upfront incentive rates for residential energy storage systems. To start, let's take a look at the average cost for residential batteries. An 8 kW or 18 kWh system currently costs about $32,800. This breaks down to approximately $4,100 per kW for an 8 kW system. These figures highlight the significant investment required for residential customers to adopt energy storage solutions. For many customers, the out-of-pocket expenses after incentives range between $7,000 and $12,000. This is still a considerable cost, which is also on top of solar costs in a solar plus storage example. It's important for us to consider how willing customers are to pay these amounts. In the Guidehouse willingness to pay survey data, which was filed with the authority on June 17th, 2024 under Order 4, the 3-year report, those findings reveal that the average residential customer's willingness to pay net of incentives is around $3,300. However, there are differences across customer segments. Low income and underserved respondents are willing to pay about $2,000, while standard respondents are willing to pay only slightly more, around $3,600. Tyler covered a little bit of this earlier in the presentation. These insights are important as they underscore the financial barriers faced by different customer groups. While the current residential incentives are generous, we do feel that the out-of-pocket expense after incentives is still a significant barrier to adoption. Next slide, please. All right. Recent increases in incentives have already led to a boost in the residential enrollment in standard and underserved communities. This positive trend indicates that current strategies are somewhat effective in encouraging participation. There are barriers to deployment that may be impacting the residential. There are other barriers to deployment that may be impacting the residential sector. Our recommendation is to hold off on modifying the current tranche 1 incentives and tranche 2 incentives levels at this time, and to reevaluate next year, as we want to see if any other program modifications, perhaps some of the ones that were discussed in this presentation, help increase residential participation. Program administrators need some additional time to fully understand market conditions and the evolving needs of participants. Given the significant remaining capacity available in tranche 1, that may last a few more years at the current deployment rates in order to be fully subscribed. We recommend revisiting tranche 1 next year until we have a better understanding of the effect of recently approved incentives on adoption, and revisiting tranche 2 incentives when we're approaching the end of tranche 1, and then use current data to design appropriate incentive levels. To ensure that we're making well-informed decisions, PAs recommend continuing to work closely with EM&B Consultant Guidehouse. This annual review process will help us gather the necessary data to make any potential recommendations around the reallocation of residential capacity to commercial and industrial sectors. Specifically, we aim to propose to consider reallocating some of the residential capacity to the C&I sector, which has a target of 290 megawatts through 2030. This would help us understand the potential impacts of the BCA, the benefit cost analysis, and ensure that we're optimizing our resources effectively. In conclusion, PAs look forward to reevaluating residential incentive levels next year, continuing to adapt to market conditions and participant needs, and ensuring the success and sustainability of the residential sector of the Energy Storage Solutions Program. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so this is the last item on the agenda, at least for the program administrators. In this section, PAs will be discussing the proposed upfront incentive rates for the commercial and industrial sector, and would like to start by highlighting the current C&I enrollment stats that we've observed as of July 2024. Both Ed and Guidehouse covered a lot of this enrollment data earlier in the presentation. To provide context, prior to May and June of 2024, as Ed covered earlier, there were only a handful of C&I applications submitted and approved in the program since August 2023, about 3 projects in total. As we got closer to the June incentive pause, we started to see an influx of C&I applications coming through all at once. This surge indicated a strong interest in the program and potentially a rush to benefit from the current incentive structure before anticipated changes in the program went into effect. As a result, program administrators are recommending declining upfront incentive rates for small, medium, and large C&I categories. The new declining incentive rates we propose to aim to provide a sustainable and manageable framework for supporting energy storage projects across these different sectors. By implementing a gradual reduction in incentive rates, we can ensure the long-term viability of the program while continuing to encourage participation and investment in energy storage solutions. Next slide, please. All right, so this slide outlines the proposed tranche 3 declining upfront incentive structure for the C&I sector and the steps taken to ensure a positive participant cost test PCT outcome. Our goal with tranche 3 was to find a structure that consistently yields total C&I PCTs at slightly above 1 or at 1, ensuring that benefits of the incentives outweigh the costs for participants. To achieve this, we have developed, in partnership with Guidehouse, a declining upfront incentive structure that is both sustainable and effective. The timeline and capacity blocks. This analysis assumes that the first 2 capacity blocks, up to 50 megawatts, will be installed in 2026. The subsequent 2 capacity blocks greater than 50 megawatts are projected for installation in 2027. Incentive for each capacity block, we reduce the upfront incentive rate by about 9% of the original rate. This gradual reduction helps in reducing incentive costs while still providing support for new projects and encouraging timely participation in an orderly fashion. The resulting declining block structure is designed to maintain a total C&I PCT of 1 across all capacity blocks, even for the last block with the lowest upfront incentive rates. This ensures that the program remains financially attractive to participants while also being economically viable. By implementing this structured approach, we aim to create a balanced incentive program that encourages ongoing investment in energy storage within the C&I sector. This method not only supports initial project viability, but also ensures long-term sustainability and cost effectiveness. In summary, the declining upfront incentive structure for Tranche 3 is a carefully crafted strategy to balance program costs and benefits, ensuring that all capacity blocks remain attractive to participants while maintaining the positive VCT. Next slide, please. All right. Our goal is to create this robust and sustainable incentive program that effectively promotes energy storage deployment while ensuring economic feasibility. The incentive structure could consist of 3 25 megawatt blocks, and the 4th block would cover any remaining capacity. This structure provides clear milestones and predictable incentives for participants in the program. Incentive rates will gradually decline across these blocks. The goal is to achieve a C&I participant cost test PCT of around 1, ensuring that the benefits to the grid and participants justify the investments. This gradual reduction ensures that the program remains attractive to new projects while maintaining economic viability. Based on feedback, we could also consider further breaking down the last 75 megawatt tranche into smaller tranches as needed. In conclusion, the proposed declining block incentive structure for the C&I sector is designed to provide predictable, gradually decreasing incentives that align with our program goals. This approach ensures ongoing support for energy storage deployment while maintaining the positive PCT. Next slide, please. And this concludes the presentation, the PA's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think Mr. Arpin has 2 or 3 more questions to bring us home. So if there are stakeholders who have not asked their questions on the presentation, I would need you to get into the queue quickly, please, so that we can take care of those before turning to public comment. So Mr. Arpin, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Bumpin, could you please turn to slide 49? So my first question here, what variables will the program administrators consider when developing a proposal to reallocate a percentage of residential megawatts to commercial customers?
Mr. Arpin, this is Sergio Carrello. I want to say that given there are 2 things, right? One is the interest that is very obvious on the C&I portion of the program, right? We have received 150, we have approved 150 plus megawatts of projects, capacity that was supposed to be available until December of 2027 has been fully subscribed. So there is a need on the C&I sector for additional capacity. That's an important driver. And the second one is something that you referred to earlier in the presentation, is the deployment levels in the residential program. Even though we have a target of 290 megawatts of deployment on residential, we have achieved 3.6, 3.8 in 2.5 years. Just to give you a reference, in connected solutions, I think they have been opened the program has been available for 5 years, 4 or 5 years. They are close to 10 megawatts of deployment. So we believe that's probably the size of the market, right? It's something that it seems that it's under 50 megawatts or easily under 50 megawatts. So we felt confident that moving some portion of the 290 megawatts allocated to residential we would be okay moving it to CNI. There is the interest in the CNI portion. It's very unlikely that on the resi side we will achieve those levels of deployment.
Thank you for that response, Mr. Carrillo. Mr. Bumpin, could you please turn to slide 52? So given the current pace of commercial enrollment exceeding the targets set by PURA, could the program administrators please explain why commercial upfront incentive levels should not decline immediately in the first capacity block for tranche 3?
Hey, Mr. Arpin, I can answer that question. Ed Cranich from the Connecticut Green Bank, and also Guidehouse team, feel free to jump in if you have any additional color to add. But the assumption there was on both the assumed install year and the fact that the incentive rates were essentially open at this in this tranche at the 200, 175, 100 level. They were expected originally to last for the first 3 years of the program. So this is essentially kind of continuing the original plan of having those rates be active for these 3 years of the program, assuming that first 25 megawatt block will actually go pretty quickly. So it's really just based on the timing and the fact that that the capacity does move pretty quickly once it's opened. And considering the expected installed cost based on the year.
Thank you for that response. Does Guidehouse have anything you would want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess I'd add, this analysis was kind of taking the perspective of, what would you need for a 1.0 PCT based on our modeling assumptions to get, over a certain period of install year and capacity block like combination, like Ed was talking through. What would those incentive levels have to be to get to that 1.0 PCT? I think maybe what you're getting at too is maybe there's taking a higher level view and seeing we already have, quite a bit of CNI adoption already, or not adoption, but customers who have started the enrollment process. Is there reason to say like maybe we should be aiming for a PCT that's lower than 1.0? Are there other considerations to take into account of, maybe we don't need as much CNI participation? And that feels like it's a little outside of the scope of, the analysis that was just done here for this. Maybe more of like a strategic sort of thinking through how the program should be built out. But again, this was looking at like, we want to continue sort of that orderly development of the market with a 1.0 PCT in all years. What are the incentive levels we might need?
Thank you for that response, Mr. Olney. So following up on that, how confident are the program administrators and Guidehouse that commercial PCT scores adequately capture all the financial benefit storage provides to commercial customers, again, considering the rapid pace of commercial program enrollment?
Yeah, I'd say there's certainly uncertainty around the two big aspects of the PCT would be the cost, the actual installed cost that the customers are actually seeing. And these costs have been updated in what we're looking at, but we don't have the kind of access or insight that, an actual customer would get from an actual, quote that they may get. And they may be seeing lower costs in some of the quotes that they're getting, which would be good because it indicates, the market is healthy and that they're able to acquire energy storage. But that would mean they'd have a higher PCT. And then the other big piece is the like sort of the value of reliability and the value of sort of energy storage that customer may have. And we've been applying sort of an average rate, but you could certainly imagine there are specific businesses that would benefit immensely from having, reliable power or, whatever the other benefits may be for their, ancillary power needs with energy storage. That is the kind of like very specific use case type info that we don't have access to either. And so we wouldn't expect that to be necessarily a revenue stream for the customer, but it could be, really important that a customer, they have important data or something on their servers and they can't afford to have a power outage. So they need that energy storage. Those would be the kind of things that would be really user specific that would also not show up in this PCT.
Thank you for that response. Do the program administrators have anything that they would like to add to that?
Yeah, I think I would just also add that we don't see the total installed cost until the system has been fully installed. We typically just see an estimate at the initial application stage because they're at a letter of intent stage, and also because a lot of these large C&I projects are on land lease agreements, so the cost is not necessarily presented to the customer in terms of the total installed cost. So we do need to wait until the end of the project to see that. The other item that I would just add on top of what Tyler had mentioned is that the demand saving benefits can certainly vary customer to customer depending on their exact demand profile.
Thank you for that response, Mr. Cranch. I'd like to thank the program administrators and Guidehouse for their presentation and time today. And I turn it back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I will echo Mr. Urban's thanks. I think that was a very thorough presentation. We've asked a lot of questions, taken up a lot of your time. So Mr. Bumpin, we can pull down the slides. I'm not seeing anyone else in the queue. We've been going for a while, but I won't pull us to a break unless it looks like there's a lot of folks who want to provide public comment. I am aware of Sonova wishing to provide a public comment statement, so we will have them take the virtual floor first. But if there are other members of the public with questions or comments, I do need you to get into the queue promptly, please. Again, the raise hand function is under the reactions tab at the bottom of the screen. And I will judge the length of that queue by whether we need to take a quick break here. So are is the Sonova team ready to make their public comment? Jamie, Charles?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for allowing me today to present and make public comments here. I'm going to be speaking for Sonova Energy on the annual Energy Storage Solutions Program review for year 4. Sonova Energy is a leading energy as a service provider with customers across 54 states and U.S. territories, including Connecticut. Our mission is to provide clean, affordable, and reliable energy, ensuring our customers can live life uninterrupted. We have a strong presence in Connecticut, participating successfully in multiple aggregated DER programs throughout the years. And Sonova's extensive experience and leadership in the energy sector really positions us as a key player in the market. Our commitment to delivering reliable and sustainable energy solutions is paramount. We strive to provide energy that supports our customers' lifestyles without interruption. And our active participation in Connecticut's energy markets and ISO New England demonstrates our dedication to supporting local energy needs, enhancing grid reliability. Today, I'm going to be discussing some recommendations on multiple fronts. I'm going to be covering the upfront incentive disbursement, modification to the passive dispatch window, and adjusting performance requirements for enhancing participation. To begin with the upfront incentive disbursement, The existing requirements for contractors managing upfront incentives create significant barriers to customer participation. These barriers arise from the complexities associated with developing financing options and the risks related to passive dispatch clawback compliance. The current process is cumbersome, leading to confusion and discouragement among potential participants. Contractors face difficulties in aligning their financial solutions with these rigid requirements, making it less appealing to engage customers within the program. To address these challenges, we propose that the upfront incentives should be based on terms and conditions which are developed collaboratively with customers, providing flexibility and simplicity. This approach allows contractors to tailor financing solutions to better match each customer's needs, ensuring that 100% of the upfront incentives reaches the customers. This will enhance satisfaction and participation in the program. And so by simplifying the process and allowing for tailored solutions, we can meet individual customer needs more effectively, ensuring the full incentive reaches the customers and ensuring widespread participation in the program. Now, the program manual outlines the eligibility and requirements for upfront incentives, emphasizing the importance of a streamlined process to encourage participation. So ensuring customers receive the full benefit and creating a more customer-centric approach can alleviate these issues and make the program more accessible. The second portion is going to be discussing the modification to the passive dispatch window. And I want to say here that we support the program administrator's proposal to reduce the passive dispatch windows from 5 hours to 3 hours, aligning it with the ISO New England daily peak periods from 5 to 8 p.m. Now, this adjustment stems from findings that nearly all ISO New England daily peaks occurred within this timeframe over the past 2 years, which we have discussed. Shortening the dispatch window to 3 hours improves the battery performance during those peak periods. Aligning the dispatch window with peak demand helps reduce the strain on the grid. Data shows that batteries maintaining higher output during shorter dispatch periods, preventing significant drops in power output. This adjustment is expected to result in better peak reduction savings and higher participation rates. Guidehouse's passive dispatch evaluation highlights that nearly all ISO New England daily peaks occur within this time frame, indicating that the 3-hour window would be better coincide with better peak demand periods and improve dispatch performance. Now, the program manual specifies that passive dispatch events are pre-scheduled and can be overridden by the EDCs for active dispatch events or emergencies. This indicates a need for alignment with the actual peak periods. So anticipated improvements in grid's abilities, the 3-hour window aligns with the peak demand periods and will result in more effective battery uses. Finally, I want to address adjusting performance requirements and enhancing participation. The current 90% performance threshold is impractical and counterproductive. Now, according to the analysis done by Guidehouse, which we've discussed earlier, no systems met this threshold due to factors beyond customers' control, such as severe weather events and technical limitations in storage systems. High participation thresholds and complex requirements reduce customer engagement. Severe weather events and technical limitations impact consistent participation. These issues create a challenging environment for customers, leading to lower participating rates and reduced program effectiveness. So Sunnova recommends lowering the performance threshold to a more achievable range and to account for uncontrollable factors. Now, these adjustments would ensure greater customer compliance and overall program success. Furthermore, we propose simplifying participation requirements and providing more flexibility to accommodate uncontrollable factors. This approach will foster greater customer engagement by setting realistic targets and providing clear, attainable goals. Now, we talked about already today about Guidehouse's data, but that most devices dispatched at the required 80% of available capacity for fewer than 30% of passive dispatch hours. Now, residential participation rates vary between 48 and 82%, averaging around 63%, suggesting a more attainable threshold would better align with actual system performance. And Guidehouse analysis also highlights the significant variation in battery performance and the need for adjustments to ensure program success. The average dispatch rates for different battery partners indicate that adjustments are necessary to reflect realistic capabilities and improve overall program compliance. So the factors beyond customers' control significantly impact their ability to meet this threshold. And a more realistic performance target that considers these external factors and supports sustainable program participation is needed. So we recommend developing a threshold that accounts for severe weather events, technical limitations, and other factors that will provide a more practical and fair standard for that threshold to ensure the customer compliance. And simplifying the requirements will make the program more accessible to customers. And ensuring flexibility in program participation requirements can accommodate varying customer circumstances and improve overall engagement. So Sonova is committed to collaborating with Pura and program administrators to optimize Connecticut's energy storage solutions program. And we really believe that the proposed adjustments will lead to higher customer participation, better grid stability, and overall program success. So thank you for the attention. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And we look forward to your questions and further discussion on these important recommendations.
All right, thank you very much. And we've got one more person in the queue for public comment, Jordan Graham.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to the authority and its staff. My name is Jordan Graham, and I'm a senior policy advisor for Tesla, where I work on residential, let me lower my hand, and grid scale energy policy in the eastern U.S. And Tesla submitted comments on some proposed fixes for the passive dispatch performance incentive and associated clawback. And I think that we were in pretty close alignment with what was put forward today with program administrators. And I'm not going to go through all of those recommendations today, but the thing I wanted to emphasize is that it's clear that there needs to be a fix. I think all parties who spoke here today have emphasized that, and I wanted to note that unfortunately, punting this decision to either the next docket or simply suspending the clawback in the interim is not going to alleviate these concerns, because it doesn't make sense to enroll a customer in a program that has undefined future performance requirements and incalculable risks for the incentive clawback. So, we think it's helpful that the program administrators have have suspended the performance requirements and associated clawback right now. But if we're going to enroll a battery in the passive dispatch now, and it's suspended for the interim, but we don't know what those requirements are going to be a year from now or 2 years or 3 years from now, we don't know what we're exposing our customers to. So we do think that this issue needs to be addressed in this docket, because if it's not, or if it's nudged towards a working group process, unfortunately, it's going to further delay participation in passive dispatch and associated deployment of residential batteries until there's more certainty associated with the passive dispatch program requirements. Jamie Charles from Sonova just laid out a slightly different vision of what a fix might look like. And I'm not here to say that Tesla's vision is right or program administrator's decision is right or Sonova is right. I just think that it's clear that there needs to be a fix, and there needs to be a fix near term. And I think there's different visions for that. And I look forward to working with the authority and with program administrators and with other stakeholders to try to figure out exactly what that is. As I mentioned, Tesla put forward our own vision and comments on what that is. And we think that we're close based off of those, but we're very happy to hear other views on this. And we want to get this right, because we'd like to be able to participate in this program. Obviously, an upfront incentive is nice for residential battery deployment, and we're hoping that we can help be a good stakeholder to make this fix. So thank you for the time, Madam Chair and the authority, and appreciate the opportunity to speak here.
Thank you. I appreciate those comments. I'm not seeing anyone else in the queue, so just go one more time. If there are any others that have comments before we adjourn today. All right. If not, that I believe brings us to the end of our agenda. And so we're going to adjourn. We will reconvene in a couple of weeks for our next technical meeting in this docket. Make sure everyone is familiar with the external schedule for this proceeding. Technical meeting 2 is scheduled. It's another virtual technical meeting on Thursday, September 12th at 9 a.m. So please stay tuned to the docket for additional written comment discovery questions from Pura. And if not, we will see you on the 12th. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating today, and have a great